Good afternoon and welcome to day two of CISO Forum Canada 2021. My name is Ali Hirji and you know me as the lead for both AI and cybersecurity at Durham College, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the post-lunch session. Some of you may remember that in 2020 at CISO Forum Canada, when discussing identity access management, I made a particular existential statement where I said, you've probably heard of the line, I think, therefore I am. And I said the line, I connect, therefore I am. Does that hold true in the online world? Just because somebody's connected and is online, does it truly mean it is them? Now, I didn't want to put my audience through an existential angst, but instead I wanted them to start thinking outside of the box, or as I like to say, burn the box, when it comes to understanding identity access management. And today, I'm going to continue that line of thought with two organizations that are leaders in this space. Come prepared with your questions, drop them in the live chat, DM them to me directly. I'm coming to you live from a state-of-the-art studio, and I'll be able to ensure that not only my questions, but also your questions get integrated into the conversation. Identity access management, for those of you who know, a growing industry, expected to go up to about $24 billion worth by 2024, and North America constitutes approximately a third of that market. And the two organizations today are leaders in this space. I invite you to go to their groups, both Okta and Auth0, and you'll get to see some of the Magic Quadrant Gartner reports, and more importantly, you'll get to see a lot of white papers there, such as buy or build when it comes to IAM, or some case studies with Ecobee, to understand how both these organizations, Okta and Auth0, have not only raised the bar, but taken IAM to a completely new level, as are the demands of the new normal that we find ourselves in. So without any further ado, we're going to dive deep into not the technology side necessarily of identity access management, but the policy side. They say that learning is continuous, and I know this is going to be a journey for the next 60 minutes that all of you are going to enjoy. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves by obviously telling you their names, what they do, but more importantly, why is identity access management so important to them? Amanda, from Ottawa, the capital, welcome to CISO Forum Canada 2021. I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourselves and get us started.
Hey, Ali, I am so grateful to be here. Yes, joining from Ottawa, Ontario, the balmy Ottawa. So my name is Amanda Rogerson. I have been working in the identity access management space for roughly around 7 years now. The last 3, though, have been like very specifically focused around the security elements of it and sort of thinking about what that means and how really identity is security, and the two are kind of synonymous and becoming synonymous as our technologies evolve. I like to think of myself as a change agent, but in my official title within Okta here is Director of Solutions, focused on telling that story around how identity really supports security strategies and how Okta can show up and help solve problems.
Fantastic, and thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to also getting into the weeds of some of the technicalities while we discuss policy. Especially, I've already actually got a message where somebody said, hey, make sure you talk about how API-centric our environments are and how does that tie into IAM. So we'll weave those in and keep you in the hot seat. I also love the tree behind you. Perfect metaphor that just like a tree, Amanda is going to help through access management keep you grounded and growing in your business. So I'm looking forward to this, Amanda. And from Ottawa, I'm going to hop on Amanda's private jet and fly off to the United States and welcome Nabeel. Nabeel, my first session with you, as well as Amanda. Welcome to CISO Forum Canada 2021. Pleasure to have you.
Hey.
Tell our audience a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why is this subject important to you?
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I'm joining from San Francisco, California. And I've been in the security side of things for pretty much my whole career for like the last 9 years, focusing at first with application security, then network security, then started getting into identity. And over the last 3 years, I really realized that identity is at the core. I think it's a fulcrum of so many different intersecting vectors, whether it comes to technologies that are like smart devices, workforce, consumer access, and really all of it is underpinned by this core concept of identity and access management. And so I've been with Auth0 now been with the Auth0 department of Okta now for 9 months. And yeah, I think what we find ourselves at is really at a threshold of an exciting time where a lot of new concepts are being defined really as we speak, and we're helping to define those concepts and those patterns and those best practices as to what does identity mean if you're a business, for your employees, for your customers, for your business customers. So that's what I'm really excited here to talk about.
Fantastic, and I noticed the tree behind Amanda. I noticed the cyclist in the image behind you, and I think that word that you said, right? Things are changing as we speak. The key when it comes to thinking and talking about identity access management is that it's constantly moving and constantly shifting as our human identities and human personalities. A very dynamic topic. So, Amanda, I'll start off with you, and then I'll go to Nabeel, and I invite the two of you to have a conversation with each other. I've had a steak lunch here. They treat us very well at CISO Forum Canada, so this is going to be very difficult for me, but I shall survive. But Amanda, I'll start off with you. And one thing that in my academic practices, or even with working with enterprise, I always mention this, that we always focus on making software and applications reusable, but the first thing is to actually make it usable. And when you get into this conversation about identity access management, there's a lot of technicality that goes into it. For example, to the audience, if you look at the Okta group, there's a good thing about the Okta Identity Engine and the building blocks to help you build your IAM protocols, like what you see is what you get kind of like model. However, the technology is deep and dense, but you also have to get into the policy side of things. How do you manage these conversations around implementation where there's technology, but there's policy as well? How do you get the conversation started?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it becomes an interesting discussion to have. And I think a lot of businesses, depending on your size, are sort of contemplating this, right? What are those use cases we want to cover? What are the things that we need to prioritize? And I think what's really interesting is sort of identity, and this idea of policy has kind of been on the back burner. Like we've almost taken it for granted for years and years, and it's becoming to that forefront. And you're right, it's this decision: do we build it ourselves? Do we buy it? Especially if you have a platform that is supporting consumers, right? Do you build your own identity store? Do you buy something that's going to support it? And I think that's where we come in, right? Because our goal is really around removing some of those barriers and reducing that overhead. And the way that we're doing that is providing trusted solutions, which really think about how do you give that balance of identity and providing identity, but also having the ability to implement policies in an automated and orchestrated way. Really, with the Okta platform, what we're focusing on is automating those identity processes, and we want to connect Okta to any downstream system. And with the acquisition of Auth0, we're able to bring more of that in on the consumer end of things as well. So Nabeel, do you want to add any additional context around that?
Yeah, totally. I think what you mentioned about technology and policy really kind of interplaying together to determine the strategy of a company, of how a company is going to approach the market. Ultimately, I think that's built into the very fabric of the products, the platform of the Auth0 platform, in that we've designed it to be continuously adjustable, where you have constant feedback in terms of getting the right kind of the logs, security logs for your teams, getting the right kind of risk assessors. For example, if you're having an MFA, someone failing an MFA test, then what caused it to fail, right? What triggered an MFA test, for example, and getting those sort of constant feedback and being able to fine tune the policy. I think being able to customize is what makes the platform so, I guess, universally appealing and so universally adaptable. And we've gone through several iterations, and actually this is playing to our strength of designing a product that can actually meet the needs of the CISO in a banking industry, as well as a growth marketer in a social app, and kind of everything that falls between. And I think one of the things you need to realize is that identity is such a, I guess, universal concept. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, what stage of maturity you're in, everyone has got an identity problem they're trying to solve. And so by its very definition, identity needs to be kind of universally accessible and then constantly adjustable in order to meet the continuing and shifting needs, like I mentioned in my previous comment, of the various businesses that are trying to solve their problems using an identity access management platform.
Fantastic,
And I think
Nabeel.
too,
Yeah, go
to
ahead,
wrap
Amanda.
that up, sorry, Ali,
No, no, not at
if
all.
you just think about that question, you're asking, difference between technology and policy. I think you really need to have technology that supports policy.
Yes.
Really, when it comes to the end of the day, right? And some of that is looking for solutions that provide things like templates that really
Yep.
help take some of those manual elements out of implementing policy. So, I don't see technology and policy as two separate things, but really sort of this one and the same. And the real benefit of that, when you sort of combine those and you have technology that supports policy, is that you're reducing a lot of those overhead costs that come with that manual sort of implementation, activation, and enforcement, so that teams within organizations can really focus on those more business critical tasks, right? You want to focus on what your bread and butter is versus having to worry about, micromanaging policies all the way across your organization.
I think that's a very key and important point you made there, Amanda, about how technology and policy actually feed into each other. Like your policy is going to be determined by the technologies available at your, at your behest, and then vice versa. You are going to implement technologies that allow you to determine the sort of that allow you to enforce the sort of policies that were already. So it becomes like a positive feedback loop. Where, I mean, I'll just to give you to de-abstract this a little bit. So if, for example, you have a policy that you're going to challenge a user with a second factor, for higher assurance. Now that's your policy that any user that logs in gets an MFA challenge. Now, that may be, that policy can be implemented many ways. So you could, for example, challenge every user that comes in, or you could build a risk assessment engine around the login, and then you have a policy, but you need the right technology to be able to do that, right? So your business incentive as a CISO is that you want to make security less onerous for your users, right? Especially, and I think this becomes very much more germane when we're talking about the consumer identity space, and we're going to get a little bit more into that later on as the discussion matures. But when you're talking about reducing friction for your users, for example, you can have a policy that only challenges suspicious logins, but you need the technology to be able to do that. On the flip side, if you have a technology that allows you to do that, then you can tweak your policy so that you're not challenging every login, but only the ones that seem a little suspicious. So I hope that helped clarify a little bit how these two kind of different concepts play into each other, and how ultimately as a CISO or someone at a C-level within a company needs to think about both of these things kind of as they conjugate with each other.
No, not only did that help expand on the topic, and I love how you've played off the conversation with each other. I think it's woken me out of the steak lunch that I had, and it's I'm going to throw in my 2 rupees of thought very quickly here. Is that for us, for example, when I do work at Durham College, or when I've interfaced with some pretty big organizations like Toronto School of Management, where we deploy applied research projects for different companies. When we talk about IAM, I really liked both of you use the term around design, and how do you design your product to support policy and vice versa. And I've always implemented this idea that there's no design. There's good design or bad design. And you need to look at these products in detail. So as we go a little forward, I mean, there's a reason why you've ranked so high, both Okta and Auth0. And I want to go into the design a little bit further as we get into the conversation, or as Nabeel eloquently put it, as we mature the conversation. So thank you for a very good, smooth takeoff. Now, I'm going to try to stay a little bit to script, but a few questions have come in, so you'll be on the hot spot. I'll throw you a googly or two, but I'm sure we'll navigate it. Nabeel, I want to start off with you, and then we'll go to Amanda, and we'll keep the conversation going that way. Nabeel, from a C-suite executive perspective, there are many reasons why you're seeing a growing adoption of very intense IAM practices and very detailed IAM practices. What are you seeing on the field? What are some stories you can share about what's driving the adoption of IAM protocols, and why is it seen as perhaps one of the most growing areas of investment over the next 3 years for CISOs? Nabeel?
I think just to start off from a very high level perspective, it's, if you want a little soundbite, it's because everything is digitizing so rapidly around us that, to manage access to multiple online applications is just becoming like, unwieldy, just to start off. But at the same time, what we're seeing is really a transformation of from individual accounts, individual users, to a kind of unified universal online identity. And I think, once again, this is especially important when it comes to consumer-facing businesses. And I think I should probably take this opportunity to elaborate a little bit on a key difference that
Please.
I think everyone really ought to be aware of. It's the concept behind what is identity access management, the way that is normally classically understood, versus consumer identity access management, right?
Yeah.
So think of it this way. So if I'm a company, let's say, Acme Corp, and I've got a bunch of employees. So those employees need to access their email, their laptops, their enterprise applications, and whatever company resources, maybe, for example, like a database. My identity access management, the way that it's typically understood, is that, and that's kind of what most of you are familiar with, is that it's the workforce use case where I'm provisioning accounts, deprovisioning accounts, assigning roles and permissions, and what kind of role-based access will I permit to each of my employees or each of my contractors, for example. There's this work, and I'm sure Amanda can speak a lot more to that, and so I won't belabor this too much. But at the key component here, the key consideration why identity access management became such a huge player globally in the tech stack is because of distributed workforces, and really because about preserving security in this distributed workforce landscape. And even within your landscape, who gets access to what, can ultimately it hinges on how you're managing the identity and access of your employees. Now, if we flip that over to the consumer side, right? Now, let's say I'm a pizza company. Then I've designed an app to make a really cool way of, let's say ordering pizza or steaks, that's what we were talking about earlier.
Right on.
Right? Yeah, you can customize your steak, however you want it, what cut, how well you want it cooked, the size and all that stuff. So a really slick steak app, for example. So if I'm Steak Corp, then my primary consideration is I want a lot of new users to sign up for my business. I want them to start engaging with my business. But at the same time, I also want to be able to protect their private data. And then also, you also want to use the information that you can gain from every time your consumers access that data to customize that experience and make that experience even more personalized, and use it to enable richer modes of customer engagement. So consumer identity access management, or CIAM, right? Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that earlier about you think therefore I am. Well, if you buy it, therefore CIAM. So
Well played. Give this man a cookie. Very well played.
Yeah. So in the world of CIAM, I think the main thing, identity is tied to, just like in workforce, identity was tied to security. What people are realizing that in the consumer world, identity is tied to revenue, right? Because this mode of thinking of security as purely as a cost center is now being flipped on its head in the consumer scape, with security being a revenue center, with identity being a revenue center, excuse me. Because every time I'm interacting with the consumer, I'm learning new insights about that consumer, where they're logging in from, what kind of steak does Ali like, so I can use that information to start customizing my experience with him. What channels, for example, does Ali like to, you like to order on the phone, but then you like to, you like to customize on the app, for example, or you like to get an email confirmation. So those kind of insights that are available from the CIAM side of things, I think people are really beginning to wake up to the importance of how central customer information and customer engagement is predicated over consumer identity, right? So it becomes a point where the CISOs, for example, are no longer looking to, they're no longer having to convince their marketing teams or their growth teams about the need to put in good security, because now it's actually converging where security interacts, and it's actually the other side of revenue as tied into consumer growth. So I think Amanda, if you want to add something to that.
Well, yeah. So I think what's interesting too is, right, there's the business sense, and we can think of this in terms of how we run our organizations. But I think the really unique thing about identity is that there's there's this awakening almost happening, right? So like there's this me as an individual interacting in the world apart from being in the business, right? I'm very concerned about my personal identity and what platforms that I log into. And I think that this is becoming a growing consciousness. We've seen over the past year, I mean, October was a horrible month for cybersecurity. Let's just be honest. It was definitely Cyber Awareness Month. But a lot
I
of
was
those
made very
attacks,
aware. I'll tell you that.
I'm very aware, very aware. But I think the population is aware too, right? We're becoming more conscious of things like business email compromise and phishing and social attacks. And those attackers are becoming a lot more sophisticated. So what we need to do as businesses is we need to think of, the fact that Verizon is still saying identity-based attacks are the leading cause of a breach.
Yep.
Well, why, what do we need to do to stem that? What do we need to do to stop that? And I'm going to argue we need to stop thinking of users as the weakest link, because I know that's been a mantra we've been throwing out there forever, right? I think we really need to realize our perimeter has changed. Like if you look at the last 2 years, we don't work in offices anymore. The perimeter really starts with our people when we're thinking of how they interact and how they access data, whether that's our internal workforce or our customers. There's a lot more entry points into our databases and into our proprietary information. So I would argue people are that new perimeter that really need those protections put in place. And that's where the technology and policies really come in. And I think that's that driving awareness. Plus, we've got regulatory and compliance that are sort of coming into play around data privacy. So a lot of businesses are also thinking at this from a protection standpoint as well. I need to protect my revenue, like Nabeel said, but I need to do it because I need to avoid ransomware attacks and financial penalties. And we're going to do that by putting policies around identity.
Fantastic. And thank you for that. I think there were two very important things that I got. And Nabeel, I'll start with you is that, you mentioned very eloquently that when you think about IAM and the work that you do at Okta and Auth0 and the engagements you're having with CISOs, that shift from a cost center to a revenue center. One of the things that we see a lot, especially with security leaders now, is the evolution of new roles, CISOs and BISOs and those intelligence officers from a business perspective, driving intelligence through neat IAM practices. So, Nabeel, thank you for flagging that. And I really find that that could be an interesting topic of discussion for the future. And Amanda, spot on. This October was definitely Cyber Very Aware Month. With everything that was on the news and everything that actually legit had happened. But more importantly, that I've always said this, that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. And you have to recognize those changes and that have to bleed into your IAM practices as well. So thank you, both Nabeel and Amanda, for that. I have 3 questions that have come in. So Nabeel and Amanda, with your permission, I'm going to weave those questions in. And then we'll tackle it from there. So I'll read this question verbatim to you. And then there's another question that's come in from Mark Dillon, Vice President of IT from Waterloo Hydro. This question, I'll read it verbatim to you, that it says, is it not possible to provision or deprovision an account, whether RBAC or ABAC, by way of persona-based IAM, either organizational or consumer? Amanda, I see your eyes light up first, so I'll put you on the hot seat.
Yeah, well, I think that there's some interesting innovations that we've made in both of our platforms that sort of tie into an API question you asked earlier, but also this idea of lifecycle management and provisioning, right? So particularly around leavers, joiners, groups that people belong to, and apps that people have access to, right? It's this idea of making sure that you have policies in place to ensure least access or least privilege. And making sure that only the right people are accessing the right things, right? So by implementing some of the solutions that we have, what we're able to do is actually allow you to set policies around people that belong in certain groups and automate processes around provisioning, deprovisioning the access. And then, within the auth we're able to actually, through those APIs, extend some ability around actually injecting that into the code where we can start looking at some policies around that. But Nabeel's much closer to that, so I'll let him speak a little more around that.
Yeah, sure. I think just there's right out of the box, there's certain degrees of configurability, such as that allow you to manage identity for customers and partners across any sort of B2B or multi-tenant or SaaS application. But there's also like, we have actions, rules, and hooks, which allow you to really customize to the nth degree, like whatever, like, for example, you can develop your own marketing persona. And actually, what some of our customers, going back to the consumer space, have done is they've used the insights, the logs from logins from their consumers to feed into their CRM, where they've been able to define personas, and then using that CRM based persona to tie back into the login. And that if you're seeing, for example, a product manager log into our application, right, then you feed them a certain level of content and a certain level of engagement, versus if you're seeing a person who's been described according to our CRM as a C-level person, they get a different sort of content. So there's a publication company in South Africa that has done pretty much what I've explained to you, using insights gained from logins, using social assessors to build a policy, feed that into the CRM, and then using that information to customize their login and their application experience.
And thank you for that. And to our audience, keep dropping in your questions. As I see them, I'll weave them in. Fantastic insight. I do see one individual, and thank you for that, Dr. Love Keshup. He said something where I mentioned the line, intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, and said, well said, Ali. That was Einstein, if I'm not mistaken, but I'll take the credit for now, if so you desire. But anyways, keep those questions coming and those interactions coming. And yes, I will remind the audience very quickly. I know a lot of people have just tuned in as well. If you get the opportunity on the platform to go to the groups, both Okta and Auth0, you will see a whole bunch of details and nice white papers and infographics that have been loaded up there. There's a case study with Ecobee, which I really, really enjoyed, and then another one around buy versus build. And I thought those provided a lot of insight, especially as CISOs today, lots of noise, more noisier than before. And as we look at new realities, some very neat, in plain terms, strategies that you can use. So please do avail of those. And if you want more, there's a lot of members from their marketing and business teams that can share more info with you. I'm going to go to the next question, and I'm going to shift the wording of it just a little bit. So Mark, previously to this session, there was a discussion happening with the CIO of Laurentian University, for example, Mark from Waterloo Hydro, and folks from CDW, where they were talking about the menace of credential sharing. And I can tell you, being in public sector, it's not all driven by malicious individuals. It can at times be driven by factors like funding, for example, and resource allocation. And one of the things we got into, but not into a lot of depth, and I'm going to bring that up here because Mark's raised it, and that's the question on how do you keep the consumer first in deploying some of your IAM practices, especially when you mentioned the topic of the steak app or the food app, which I would love. But you get the point, is that you've got to keep the consumer first. As opposed to having an IAM practice that's done to them, you want to have an IAM practice that involves them. How do you take a consumer and customer first approach to IAM? Amanda, we'll go to you, and then we'll hop over to the United States to Nabeel. Amanda.
Yeah, so I'll think about it from your employees being your customer, because let's face it, that's also a component to this as well, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with as you set your policies around the applications that need to be protected, give your employees choice. What authentication factor do they want to enroll as they're enrolling? What's going to be easiest for them? Now, you can also set policies around, stronger factors, less strong factors. When do they need it? When do they not need it? And that really sort of brings the employees as a part of your security team. And then there's interesting ways where we can actually embed some of that enrollment in, the actual sign up process. And Nabeel, I know, when we were talking about signing into the CyberX platform, we were talking about this a little bit there. So, I know that you have some very strong thoughts of, that from that consumer angle, how can we actually think about, bringing our consumers as a part of that security layer as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because as I'm logging into our session today, I realized I had to fill in 2 forms, including my zip code and my phone number and everything in order to be able to present today. And it really hit home just the importance of what like consumer identity access, what CIAM really, how powerful it is, because I guess one of the key differentiators for a company, like let's say you're a business that's trying to grow, going back to the consumer first perspective, right? there's a few Amazons in the world and that's it. So, but what do you do if you're not an Amazon, right? And the way you really differentiate is by having that really slick, rich customer engagement experience that, knows who your user and knows their preferences, challenges them only when necessary to protect their accounts, but, provided only the minimal acceptable amount of friction. So I think there's many different considerations when it comes to, having a consumer perspective, consumer first approach that only, I guess, people are beginning to think about now. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So, when it comes to, for example, the amount of acceptable friction, if I'm, at my, if I'm logging into my work computer and I need to, access my Duo app to enter whatever, an OTP and whatnot, I'm okay because, I'm getting paid to do this and this is my job and I understand the risks involved. But if I'm trying to sign up for that steak app or, whatever, like I need that customer acquisition process to be as friction-free and as slick as possible, while at the same time, and I don't want to minimize this one bit, because there is a whole world of new account fraud, right? That is also completely crippling a lot of businesses, where you have these bots signing up and you have spammers and scammers. Like there was a Distill study done, I think in 2019, where they found that of the Alexa top 10,000 websites, 100% of them had sign up bots, like on their login pages, 100% of the top 10,000. So it goes to show that if you're looking at it, if you're, for example, you're a growth marketer and you're concerned with signups and a bulk of your signups are coming from bots, already that's bad because you're not getting the right kind of feedback to design policies around. Secondly, a lot of these businesses, like who are not Amazon, they're trying to lure in new customers by providing new customer incentives, right? Sign up for Steak Corp and you get like a 1/8 of a filet mignon or something like that, right? And a lot of customers do that. I know that I've personally interacted with a lot of businesses, where they give you a $10 off coupon or $5 in credits for your first purchase. Imagine like the new account fraud risk if you have that $5 for the first purchase multiplied by 10,000 bots, right? So there is a whole, that is definitely a very real concern. However, using the sign-up process to be the first chance to impress your customer, right? Because that's really what this is, right? SIAM, in a sense, is really, it's the first chance for the company to make a good impression, right? So if I, for example, can just sign up using Google or using my social account, and then that whole sign up experience goes from filling out a form to one click and I'm in and I'm registered, right? So that is an example of how you can leverage already existing technologies that are built around a consumer first platform, consumer first mindset, and then use that to leverage and kind of, give yourself the competitive advantage, right? As opposed to a business that's still relying on forms, which really are so antiquated and, they hurt conversion, right? So from going back to the consumer first revenue perspective, I think it becomes even more important that friction is as minimal as possible, because that's going to hurt conversion and much more so than in a workforce environment.
And I think the other thing to add, to take it back to the question earlier about APIs, right, is, you don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to this kind of thing, right? So you may have a consumer-based app, and I know, as Canadian, I have my hydro app, I have my healthcare app, like I have those apps that I interact with on a daily basis. I was one of those wonderfully lucky people that got involved in a credit card breach and had my information stolen. So for me as a consumer, very, very top of mind is protecting my accounts, especially on some of those more sensitive apps that I actually have my address and my financial data. So having that sort of extensibility and that option built in during the login process or that sign-in process gives me the option to opt into more security. And it also, it gives that balance of security and usability, which I think is really key when we're thinking about identity and policy and how do the two marry together. We want to have security almost has to become that invisible magic that runs behind the scenes that, is very, I think you said an acceptable level of friction or something like that, which I really, really like that idea, right? Is there has to be a little bit there that lets me know as a consumer that I'm interacting safely. But then you as a business, you need to make sure that users coming in aren't introducing additional risk. And a lot of that can be done by tying APIs in from systems like ours or using SDKs from systems like ours into apps that you already have established.
Absolutely. Nabeel, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to your point about what is the acceptable level of friction, I think as a CISO, you would probably be aware that depending on the sort of organization, right, that acceptable level of friction can vary greatly. So I like to give the example. For example, if you're if you're just like a social customer app that is focused really on just growing your customer base, that acceptable level of friction would be would be very low. And also like depends on what the stakes, what kind of stakes are if there is a breach, right? If there's like, okay, there's somebody spamming my platform, it hurts your reputation, but it's not the same thing as if you were, let's say, the CISO of a FinServe company, and now you've got, or let's say a crypto exchange even, right, which are not federally insured. Now the acceptable level of friction like shoots up like by orders of magnitude, because as a consumer, I expect there to be a certain level of friction, because that gives me confidence that I can trust this platform in that they are protecting their accounts. And then on the other hand, for example, if you have a healthcare or personal health app, that becomes tricky because, in a lot of healthcare like use cases, your user base may not be so tech savvy, to be like, equipped with WebAuthn, capable phones, for example, or to be, to be downloading like authenticator apps. So how do but at the same time, what's at stake is like private health information. So, I think for that, the acceptable level of friction is the concept that, it really, that we're trying to articulate that for a lot of different industries, but what we found is that if you're a healthcare app, or if you're a fintech, or you're a crypto exchange, or if you're a social app, that acceptable level of friction is going to vary greatly. And it's really, understanding who your consumers are, what sort of technologies they're capable of interacting with, and then what are the risks of your business, right? And how does that play with, the consumer mindset? That is going to determine what that acceptable level is. So I just wanted to kind of, say that acceptable level of friction is not a static, or it's not like a silver bullet for all of these industries. It really varies across industry and across use cases.
Let's work a little bit with that customer-centric, consumer-centric approach that we've been evangelizing for this time. It's extremely important. Amanda, I'll start with you, and then I'll go back to Nabeel. And for CISOs, for C-suite executives that are deploying IAM policies, one of the most important elements in all of this, you've got good processes in place, good technology, but you also have to establish a currency of trust. And many times when you develop these models and these designs for different products, let's talk the stake application, etc., you've got to give the consumer that trust. And one of the ways in which you further that dialogue of trust is by giving them control over the process as well and their data. Can you shed a little bit of light around this subject? And we'll go back and forth on that. We've got about 18 minutes left, so I think we'll tackle this question and one more, and then return back to our end. So Amanda, over to you.
Yeah, I think this becomes an interesting one. And I know in many C-level communities, this notion or conversations around zero trust is becoming sort of this key sort of mantra, right? How do we have zero trust? But I almost feel like it's a little bit of a misnomer because, the whole premise behind zero trust is trust but verify, or, don't imply trust. And it almost causes almost an immediate friction when you we're implementing a zero trust policy. I think the better way to think about that is, sort of what we're doing is we're establishing that you are who you say you are, right? Nabeel is who he says he is when he's accessing my apps, whether he's doing it as a consumer and I'm providing a service or good, or if he's my employee. I want to make sure that Nabeel is who he says he is. And a lot of that has to do with collecting those context cues. And we need to make sure that systems and that we're implementing are doing that in such a way that aren't violating regulatory laws and requirements, right? So in Canada here, we've got PIPEDA. How do we make sure we comply with PIPEDA? And if we're interacting with UK countries and European countries, GDPR, and we've got California protections around data as well. So this whole idea of data privacy is really interesting. And I think where that conversation starts to go is that privacy is really this dynamic concept, and trust is this really dynamic concept. And I think it's constantly evolving as we look at it. Nabeel mentioned, the acceptable friction and how do we actually, depending on the app they're accessing, what do we need to collect and how do we need to evaluate that interaction? And I think that's really where it comes into, where CISOs have to think about, what are people accessing? What do I have to protect? What does hold sensitive information? And how do I make sure that I have adequate layers of protection around my most sensitive pieces of data? How do I ensure that that data remains protected? And a lot of that comes down to making sure that we have those layers of trust in place, which is all based on context. And I can think of my own personal experience. Like when I use PayPal, it recognizes my device now. So it has that layer of trust built in because it can actually say, yep, I know this person, I know this device, this has been used before. But if I go into an incognito browser, it immediately goes, whoa, no, wait, you need to give me more information because I don't really know who you are. So as a consumer, I feel a sense of security knowing that there's going to be those extra roadblocks in place to stop somebody who's trying to, hijack my identity and hijack my access. So it builds that layer of trust with your consumers, and then with your workforce as well. I think that's equally important. I mentioned earlier, our people aren't our weakest link in the workforce. They're really our strongest security line of defense. And I think when we put that trust in our employees to take those appropriate actions, you remove some of that friction behind this idea of zero trust or not trusting, because really what we're doing is we're saying, we do trust you, but we want to make sure that you're actually you. And we're going to do that by looking at some, context cues around location, authentication, device, and use machine learning to really make some, intelligent decisions. And Nabeel, I know you and I had a great conversation about this yesterday when we were talking about some of the dynamics around trust. And, we both are committed to, on our platforms, building solutions that meet all the requirements, that drive data privacy. But I know you have some unique thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because identity access management started out as like the ability for an organization to trust the users. But now with CIAM, what we're seeing is like it also becomes a way for the users to trust the organization, right? What kind of controls do you have in place? How can I assure that you're not going to abuse the data that that you need in order for you to provide the service? And I think to that end, like I said, I would like to speak a little bit about both of these aspects, right? So from the first aspect of how do you trust your user, once again, having the ability to get the right sort of like data signals, device information, for example, what is your geolocation? What is your identity? What is your OS that you're that you're accessing from? These and many other sort of indicators can allow the business and the ability to trust the user, so that like the PayPal example you gave, right? What that does, traditionally we were always, CISOs and, security folks, we were always given this sort of binary choice between security and friction, right? And it's like, well, you have security or ease of use, but now with the ability of trust, the trust introduces a third coordinate in that, right? So you can actually have more security and less friction because you have more trust, like your PayPal login example, right? So there's that aspect of how IAM and enables trust when it comes to trusting your users. Going back to your question about how do users learn to trust the business, by implementing, for example, we've seen such a swell of data privacy regulation, from in the past few years. LGPD in Brazil, API in Japan, CCPA and CPRA in the US. And really, just an overall culture shift with, people and humans demanding that their information, that going back to that their digital identity that we mentioned at the beginning, right? That be respected and protected as a matter of, as de facto. So, that's why like we've kind of, we've built this agnostic cloud service that ensures that our systems like meet these regulatory requirements, but that also provide the transparency that any user or any business that is our customer can see where the data is being used for what purposes, and also providing them the control to be able to determine what kind of data can be used for what purposes. Now, of course, there are, I guess, payoffs and drawbacks to like
Absolutely.
opting out of certain data. So, for example, like going back to the holy grail of challenge only when needed, right? One of the kind of key value propositions of having an intelligent identity access management system is you need to collect those sort of indicators, right? Like when Amanda's logging in from her Chrome browser, from a regular Chrome browser, there's data signals she's feeding. And I think there's an implicit understanding, which you opt into, or you can opt out of, to know that, okay, if I will be logging in from my regular browser, I will be providing you with these signals. There will be a certain degree of, consumer data that you will need to provide me with that service. However, any additional, I guess, transaction that may be done with that data, anything else that's done with that data, that needs to come with that permission. And I think companies as a whole, tech as a whole, and especially when it comes to an identity access and an IAM company like ourselves, where we see so much customer data, right? Whether it's like where you're logging in from, what device it is, what are your, what time of day you're logging in, like what is your browser preference, and so on and so forth. All that data, like if we were not to safeguard that, like with utmost, seriousness, I think we would lose our credibility as an identity provider. And that's why, like from our end, when companies leverage us for identity, they're showing their consumers a sort of transitive property of trust. We trust them, so you can trust them. Therefore, we can trust you in a sense.
Yeah. I think you brought up a really interesting quote when we were talking to Bill. Sorry, Ali. Then I'll let you take it back over you. But you said, oh gosh, consumers vote with their feet. Right, and they'll walk away from doing business with companies who they don't agree with the data privacy practices, and that is a big risk when you experience a breach, right? Is your brand, your reputation, everything gets damaged. So this idea and this notion of transacting with companies and solution providers that you can trust is really key. And I think that's why we have such a commitment to providing transparency into our roadmaps and our thinking, because we've actually operationalized this idea of trust because we are a developer-led brand, right? And really what we're focused on is enabling our customers and industries to protect their users, both internal, external, third party, doesn't matter where those users are. And we want to, sort of encourage that speed of adoption, that speed of modernization, and really support innovation. Sometimes that even, I like to say we drink our own champagne. So we use our own systems internally to protect our employees as well as our customers. I like champagne much better than dog food, because I don't know if you've ever tried dog food. Even bad champagne is good. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
So yeah, we employ a lot of our own technologies, to protect our events, to protect our employees, because we have that much faith in it.
Ali, if I may just have one final comment on this. Amanda, you said something really interesting earlier, which was, or I think it was yesterday, when you said that, code wasn't built to be secure, right? And just similarly, code wasn't designed for privacy, right? That was kind of that's not how code evolved. So now it's just like, if you're a developer, if you're like trying to build an application, and you're a developer that wants to, that wants to respect these new like values of trust and data privacy while also maintaining security, right? That's where I think like leveraging a sort of, platform where like we've built data privacy right into, our application, right? We've built all these, the implicit trust, the indicators for trust, the ability to maintain privacy and adjust those privacy controls. We've built that. And I think that's why, one of the reasons why, especially like as growing businesses need to show to the Amazons, to the big behemoths of the world, that they're not only providing a really slick customer experience with like snappy logins and smooth UX, but they're doing this at the same time while respecting the user privacy, because they're implementing systems that are built using such practices like Auth0, like Okta. It once again, it imparts that implicit trust and makes it explicit for the consumers.
I'm going to go back to something Amanda said. Consumers vote with their feet. These folks are dropping wisdom like fire on this session. Put that on a shirt. I'm looking to the event organizers. There's a place on the platform called The Volt where they make these fancy designs, and we're loving the production and all of that stuff. Put that on a shirt. But I mean this because you've come together with some really interesting ways to think and rethink identity access management. So please continue the conversation. We do have approximately 5-ish minutes left, and I see about 6 questions that have come in. I'm going to take one, and I'm just going to work with that one, and then we'll have to come to a soft landing because I do have to vacate this hot seat for somebody else to take over. This question comes in from Kevin O'Donnell. Lovely question. I'll ask it verbatim. Kevin asks, do you see the push to open banking/data, like PSD2, like regulation, causing major disruption in Canada's tech landscape? Nabeel, you first for 2 minutes, Amanda for 2 minutes, and then concluding remarks.
I'm sorry, what landscape? In the which landscape?
Open banking in the Canadian finance.
Okay, right.
Yes.
I will, I'm not being Canadian, but I'm pretty familiar with PSD2. I think that, yes, open banking is, it was one of the biggest forcing functions for financial countries, like financial institutions worldwide, with their, I guess the most tangible, their tangible point of interaction with us, with the identity space, was around strong customer authentication, like SCA, and all the new standards of authentication that, for the first time, it was that any sort of government, any sort of state agency had made formal. For example, like you couldn't authenticate using an SMS OTP. So there was the prescriptions were that specific. And in terms of how that opens up, how that opens up the banking landscape. I mean, we're already seeing challenger banks like from Europe, Singapore, Japan, everywhere pop up, like N26 is a customer of ours. And the ability to share information share the right amount of information with the right level of authorization across multiple channels, I think that will accelerate, it will turbocharge the centrality of identity as this data is shared across with the appropriate consent of the user. Because this is a really concrete example of where all these things, these ideas of privacy, connectability, extensibility, interoperability come together. So yeah, we are full force ahead when it comes to developing APIs for the FinServe industry, and we're aware that there's PSD2 and other adjacent similar regulations worldwide, which we're already interacting with, are only at the very they're only beginning to take shape.
Yeah, so I'll chime in. With a bit of a Canadian. Love us. We're amazing. We're trying. We're getting there. We are moving in a direction. But I would definitely say, in terms of technology adoption, Canada does lag a little bit behind in some ways, and a lot of that has to do with our government regulations. There are no clear-cut government regulations that sort of direct a lot of these things in the same way that there are in other parts of the world. So I think what's really going to be interesting with the open banking is to actually see how our financial institutions, which are largely crown corporations in Canada, and how they interact with sort of that government space and the federal space, because I think that there's this interesting dichotomy that has to be sort of navigated between the two, and there's that complexity that sort of comes into play within the Canadian landscape when it comes to this type of thing. But I am very excited about what open banking and PSD2 is actually bringing to the table, because I almost think it's going to be a forcer that is going to, we're either going to jump on it and move with it, or we're going to be left behind, is sort of my sense of things. So how did I do? I think I did the 2 minutes. Is it good, Ali?
I was gonna go this way, look at my phone, and then I realized I got more things than you have on. So never mind. But yes, we've got another 2 more minutes and a couple of questions. I'm going to squeeze one last one in, and then to everybody else, please feel free to drop your questions to the panelists on Cyber Exchange or reach out to the teams at Okta and Auth0, and they'll gladly respond to you. I saw this one coming, slightly general, but we'll take it. It's about blockchain, mathematical proof that something happened. Very general question, but we'll take it. Amanda, we'll start with you, and Nabeel will conclude with you. Amanda, blockchain. How are you thinking through it when it comes to IAM?
I mean, blockchain is this interesting thing, and I think that it's Uh, we
Enough
need
said.
a whole hour
2
just
minutes
to
is
talk
not the
about
right, yeah.
blockchain. You know, it's not an easy question to answer. It's definitely something that is coming up more frequently when we're starting to think about how we implement policy, how we evaluate things, how things are sort of handled. But yeah, it's not a question that I can answer sort of in a short sound bite. So, you know, I'd much rather take that one offline unless, Nabeel, you have any specific thoughts for it.
I mean, I would just say that a blockchain is one of the, I mean, there's a big push around decentralized identity. I think that's a
Yep.
general kind of theme that blockchain
Yeah.
would fit into. And there's, you know, there's benefits that we can imagine, like, you know, just multi-party verification, distributed attributes and so forth. But yeah, we're gonna have to have like a 2-hour
We need a whole hour for
and
that
a
one.
much bigger panel as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I really like, both the references, to centralized and decentralized identities. And what does this mean to CISOs who are starting to think about the evolutions around identity? Nabeel and Amanda, we're a couple of seconds away from the end of this session, and we do have to hand over to the next. But on behalf of CISO Forum Canada, I sit on the board on the behalf of all of my fellow colleagues who are here, quite a few folks, Luc Roy from Laurentian University, Kelly Irving from the Electrical Authority here, who's the CIO, many of us who are here and watching this live. I want to thank you. And I will say this before I'm going to ask you to stay on while I bid the audience adieu. We had a particular script, we followed it, but then as the questions came along, you took it down such an interesting path. I thought we were going to land on the question of the return on investment around IAM, but you reminded me that I can also stand for the return on innovation and the return on imagination. Thank you for making IAM an exciting subject to talk about, and one that is very multidisciplinary and very inclusive once you start to think about the multiple pieces that tie into our identity. So I will say this, I learned a lot from this session, but more importantly, you've reminded me that when it comes to identity access management, nothing is set in stone, it's set in jello. And we've got to appreciate that and have conversations like this. So to everybody that's watching, thank you for tuning in. Please join me once again in thanking Nabeel and Amanda. And if you want to learn more, please connect with them on the platform or go to their respective groups, and their team members will be happy to furnish you with more information. See you at the very next session. Stay safe, stay healthy. Cheers.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.